So this is going to be a demo on how to trim this style of lid onto this vessel. So first make sure that when I put my vessel back down onto the wheel that it is spinning on center, or else it's going to be really difficult to trim that lid. So a lot of times, for some reason, I guess it's because the bats are a little bit wobbly, I'll have to put the bat on in the other direction. So using the other, reversing the bat pinholes. And sometimes that puts it a little bit back on center. I mean, it looks pretty good. If it's totally off center, you might want to just cut it, center the piece directly onto the wheel, and then trim at that point. I like to use a little piece of plastic, so I'm avoiding any kind of bonding that's happening between the lid and the form itself. I try and keep that piece of plastic a little bit small so it doesn't keep flying around and it doesn't stop what I'm seeing. So there's a good amount of clay here. Like I said in my last video, I like to have the opportunity to trim a knob from this mass of clay here. So I know that there's a good amount here, so I'm going to first just go in and take off a good amount of it for trimming. And making sure also that I'm trimming downward, because there is a lot of weight onto this lid. It's important that you assess, how much weight do you have in this area here. So you don't want to leave this too thick. You want to make sure that it still feels light, that you're matching the interior shape that you threw to the exterior shape that you trimmed. Note as well that if you have an excessive amount of clay that you've left here, and let's say you want to trim a very large knob, as you start trimming, that clay might seem wetter and wetter. So you might need to take off some, pause, put it in front of a fan, let that clay that you've exposed now dry a little bit more, and then proceed in trimming. So again, this is an act of patience for sure. You put a lot of effort into throwing this form, throwing the lids, throwing the spouts, doing all of this work. Don't rush these things that really do make a difference in the big scheme of things. So I'm thinking about the shape of the form that I have already and how this knob fits the shape of the form that I have. It shouldn't seem so disconnected. So have that in your mind as you think about what you want to make. The finial to the lid should not be so distracting from the form itself. This is a very volumetric vessel, and I feel like the knob should kind of fit that as well. It definitely doesn't seem like it should have a little tiny, teeny, delicate little knob. So I'm trying to keep that in my mind as I'm trimming and trying not to be too aggressive. With that knob, now I can lift this off, making it a lot easier to lift off because I've had that piece of plastic there, which is nice. And now at this point I'm going to wire cut the piece and I'm going to trim the piece. 45-degree angle pretty much, so it's going to be able to fit up against this form nicely. So this can be a little bit tricky to some, so I recommend kind of, using a pencil and kind of sketching things out. So some things I do is I'm using just this board to kind of give me about a 50-50 line, and then I'm drawing a line here. And I could draw this up against, you could use a needle tool, whatever you want for this. And I'm just marking this because I need to cut this pretty symmetrically. So I'm drawing a line up on this side, lines here. So basically it's telling me that I need to go from here over to this side. And I'll turn that over to you guys so you can see this. So what I'm doing is I'm drawing kind of a cutout of where I'm gonna cut away, but I need it to be symmetrical from one side to another. So I want to definitely look at this from multiple directions. Give myself some time to kind of draw this out. Now it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, right? And I'm going to show you ways of refining this. So I'm going to trust that my cut is pretty good, or my line that I drew, and I'm going to go and start cutting. So I've cut this section away now, which is going to help as it fits up against the form, but still you can see it just still doesn't really fit very well right now. So what I am going to do now is I'm going to start coring out this interior edge. I'm also going to do that towards that top edge. So what I'm doing is I'm kind of thinning things out. I'm getting it to be pretty uniform in thickness from the body, this whole body of the spout to this edge. So anywhere that seems a little thick, I'm going back and I'm kind of just carving it away. So another tool that's really helpful, because sometimes you don't want like this kind of points here. I like to use a Sureform. So Sureform allows me to kind of get those cuts that I did really refined, way better than I can do by hand. So I can taper that corner down. And again, I'm just doing this very lightly, and I can taper this corner down. So instead of relying completely on that knife, this Sureform is giving me this nice kind of even cut that maybe I would just struggle doing just with my hands. It's giving me a little bit more of a refined look. So I'm going to go back now, and I'm going to still kind of take away some of this excess clay. This is where I Sureformed. I kind of brought it back to a blunt edge, and I want it to be a pretty thin edge for attachment. And I'll go back on that upper area as well. See how right now this edge up here is pretty thick? So I'm going to go back with my knife. Take a lot of that off. It's important to go pretty slowly with your spouts. I do recommend, that's why I do recommend throwing more than one, especially in the beginning. Cannot tell you how many times I've just errored in cutting and spouts totally unusable. So to avoid having to wait again for another spout to be thrown, to dry, it's much easier to have a selection to go from. So, I mean, I also have this one here if I mess up. All right, so you can see I've thinned that edge back, thinned all those edges back. And I can see kind of how this looks now. Clear this off. See how this looks up against my form. I'm overall pretty pleased. I know it looks like it doesn't fit yet, but I'm not done. So what I want to do now is I want to kind of eye this on so it seems straight. And again, I could use a pencil, I could use a needle tool, whatever I have. And I'm giving myself an outline. Now, when I get to this point, I'm making sure that my needle tool or my pencil doesn't dip under, right? I want to get a good idea of where this spout is actually attaching. So I'm holding it more kind of parallel. This is also a nice way to see how well you cut your spout, is when you see this outline on the form. So when you look at the outline, is the outline really skewed? Does it look fatter on one side and thinner on the other? If it does, you might want to fix it. So I'm going to use this little hole puncher to just put a few holes for when my spout gets attached. And I'm just going slowly in and pushing this through. I make sure that these aren't too close to one another, because sometimes that pressure putting this in can cause the piece to break. So if the holes are too close to one another, then you're going to end up with a pretty big hole. So, and I'm just going pretty slowly. If the cuts look a little rough, I'll go in and kind of refine them with a paintbrush, but overall that's what I have now. Okay, so now I'm ready to attach my spout. It is really helpful to have a serrated rib. It is also really helpful at this point to have really good slip, because this spout needs to be excessively slipped and scored in order to really mold onto that form. So I go through this multiple times. I'm going to score and slip this spout till that edge really seems very flexible. So that was mostly the reason why I took so much time really thinning that edge down, making it nice and even, is the scoring and slipping will aid in that thinner edge becoming more flexible and moldable to the form that you threw. So again, I'm just keep going back and forth. Again, scoring and slipping. So how much you do this is dependent on how stiff your spout has become. I do not recommend them getting so hard, but know that in order to use that Sureform tool and to cut the spout nice and clean and even, it definitely can't be wet. So expect to have to score and slip a good amount. So I'm going to lay this over to the side right now. And using the outline that I did when I placed my spout on top of my teapot, I'm going to now paint some slip in here inside that line, because remember it's going to attach right at that line ideally, and I'm going to score and slip just right up to that line. I'm going to try not to score where I made the holes, because you might be able to see that depending on how narrow your spout opening is. So I want to kind of keep my score marks kind of contained. So I'll turn this to you guys so you can see what I'm doing. So for those of you who have worked with me, you'll know that a lot of times I will use a lot of water for connections. That is not the case when I do spouts at all. I definitely kind of err on the side of caution of really using slip. And if you're choosing to do these forms in porcelain, without a doubt, I'm going to use slip. So I pretty much have that roughed up pretty well. I'm going to make sure I just do this one more time on here. Really making sure things seem pretty flexible. Okay. So I'm going to turn this to me. I'm going to line this back up. Make sure it's straight. And that scoring and slipping is really going to aid in allowing this form to mold to the teapot body. So I also like to make sure that I'm kind of wiggling it back and forth, getting those score marks to lock in place, while also making sure it's still staying straight. Making sure as well it's well connected at the bottom edge. All right. So now I just have to clean up. My cleanup is quite simple for this. I'm going to use first just a sponge to really get things molded well together. Notice that I'm not using a ton of water. I'm using more just a damp sponge. And I'm putting pressure, light pressure, make sure things are connected. I also like to use multiple paint brushes to be able to really seal in where I scored and slipped. Try this one. So I'm also cleaning all those score marks. And this is where, really refining the spout comes into play. Because, you know, when I had this spout on the wheel, I really didn't get a chance to really refine anything. It's difficult to do at that time. So again, just using this sponge can kind of clean up throwing lines. So usually I'll work on refining this for a bit. I always want to make sure too that I tip this over and I'm making sure that this is really totally connected and refined. I don't just trust my eye from, you know, that one perspective. I want to turn this and make sure that it's nice and clean, it's well connected. So at this point, I can definitely make some decisions about how I feel about the spout. Do I feel like it's too long? So I might want to do certain changes to the spout at this stage. So sometimes I like to cut the spout so it has a little bit more of a straight line across. And this can be tricky. You can do a knife. Another way of working is using a sureform. So pulling this sureform, making sure it's straight, you know, it's sitting level when you're doing this, and just go slowly. And start taking that clay off. Might want to go at this from a few different angles just to make sure it's nice and straight. And then again, I'm going to go back and really refine this. So sometimes that's a little bit of a nicer cut to have. Okay, the last part of assembling a teapot is one of the most favorite parts, which is pulling a handle. So I definitely want to make sure I'm going to do a handle that's straight across from the spout. So I definitely want to make sure that I don't put it crooked. So it's important, you know, put some sort of gauge for yourself that is allowing you to see directly across, and then you can start doing a few score marks so you're placing that handle directly opposite the spout. Note as well that I took the lid off. I'm going to pull this handle directly off of the piece, so I want to make sure that I don't drop the lid. And trust me, that's from experience of dropping the lid and forgetting to take it off. So just take my words of advice there. And using a serrated rib again is so helpful because I'm going to take this and flare those edges out. And I'm giving myself kind of a high point in that center. So just whenever, how I do any other handle, I'm gonna first press it in. And I'm gonna start kind of just wiggling it back and forth, getting those score marks to really lock in place to one another. I'm gonna clean all these edges up. Sometimes for this, I like to use a paintbrush as well. Areas that my hands kind of just can't really get to. But most of all, more than anything, more than cleaning it, all of those things. It doesn't matter how well you clean it if the handle does not stick on when you start pulling. So that should be your main goal, to really get that handle nicely attached. This teapot upright, we can start getting that clay prepped to pull, hydrating it, getting it into the shape that I want, starting to kind of have a plan that I'm formulating in my head, how I'm going to do this, what shape I want. Making sure it's staying nice and straight as I'm working. So I'm going to start pulling. And again, I'm going to turn it straight towards me. So it's positioned like this now. Turn it back. Now I'm going to position it again straight towards me. And one more time, make sure it's straight. Turn it, line it up to my score marks. Look at it from the side, look at it straight. I'm going to give that a light press just to end. I'm going to kind of assess how I feel about it. Do I want to pull more? Do I want to give it a little bit more of an arch? I'm going to take this off. I'm going to pull a little bit more of an arch into this. I'm going to tip the teapot a little bit more forward. That's what I'm doing. Now again, I'm going to turn it. You see how that gave it a little bit more of an arch upward. Definitely more pleased with that. Let me put this back. Handle looks. Cut that excess away. Most of the blending, refining of the handle, I'll do when the piece has set up much more. But I do want to make sure that I get this shape exactly how I want it. So at this point, other than some refinement, the teapot is complete.